and thank you for giving up your lunch hours to come and listen to what I hope will be a reasonably interesting presentation on the First World War and strategic bombing. And I suppose I should start, especially to those who've known me for a very long time, by explaining how someone who's been a historian of tactical air power in the Second World War has managed to involve himself with strategic air power in the First World War. And I can only plead interest to that, as I hope that interest will be apparent as I go through. Rather than sort of leaving time for Q&A afterwards, what I'm willing to do, if you're willing, is to sort of take it with questions and observations for people as I go through, and we can address it that way. I need to be off by about 1:55. Are you happy with that approach? So, you know, so stop me and by one as you see fit. The image that you see there sums it up very much for me, a very poignant, perhaps understated image of civilians looking at the devastation of their homes as a new way of warfare has come upon them, a new way of warfare that had to be interpreted. And it's that sort of journey that I'll be putting some signposts in place, and not least, let me say this right from the outset, giving due acknowledgement to the scholarship that's already done a great deal in this field. What interested me in this particular what set this ball rolling on from my perspective? Well, the First World War Centenary, the setting up of the First World War Research Group and getting interested in some of the themes that were being raised, and as predominantly a Second World War historian, some of this was quite new for me, and coming into contact with those copies of the First World War bombing surveys, which I'll talk about a little later, that we hold in the JSE library archive here, and they're quite interesting documents, and generating an idea that perhaps those early bombing surveys, which we may perhaps see as one of the early attempts to interpret the effects of total war, how they may fit in the wider air power experience of trying to interpret what bombing can do, so that there may be a pattern which is discernible through those early surveys, following through to the later surveys that came at the end of the Second World War and perhaps beyond. Are there patterns there, trends, that tell us something about how the air power experience has been interpreted in an attempt to learn from experience and the pitfalls and the problems of that, how far that's been pushed? There's data out there, there's been analysis on that, but it's interesting perhaps to consider how far those patterns that have been identified can be taken forward and help perhaps put the First World War experience into some significance. So there is the potential to extend beyond the First World War, but there's a need to develop the understanding and formulate some ideas. And this brief presentation is some thoughts that occurred to me that have been generated by my looking at those surveys and the implications that might come out of that. There are a few, for me, anchor points on the journey that I've taken, which I want to talk through with you and perhaps share some thoughts and responses that have left thoughts in my mind that I think are significant and perhaps can be followed through, that maybe signpost this journey. What's in a name? Strategic bombing. If you look at the data from the First World War itself, you don't see that term. Maybe there's people in this room who can correct me on this, but I've not come across it. It's a post-1918 term. And some of the analysis that's been looked into strategic bombing, and particularly I was struck by David McIsaac's book from the 70s, his work on perhaps how this term came into play. They chose the term strategic bombing. They might have called it something else, but to what purpose? And this particular idea that once that term became in place, it implied a provision that operations were entitled to a special place of its own in the formulation of basic war strategy. That's been a theme that's generated debate for a considerable period of time, and yet it's interesting to try and link that with that very first tentative bank of experience that came into place in the First World War and the first tentative attempts to interpret it. What are the first principles of bombing? I started to ask myself. And identified there by Noble Franklin in his book, which was the bombing offensive against Germany, of course, in the Second World War. Military utility, morally permissible. What was the intended object? How did the targeting relate to that? It looked like a basic, good frame of fundamental principles. How long have they been in place? To what extent, perhaps, did the First World War experience, and particularly its interpretation just after that experience, started to put these fundamental principles in place? I'm looking here to see how a pattern emerges. Not a pattern of just the looking at bombing, but trying to look at the early questions that arose out of the experience and how they were addressed, how they were interpreted. What was the significance of trying to interpret this? Total war. It seems that the First World War experience is defined by total war, the mobilization of society for war, the focusing of national effort and resources, and as that evidence seems to suggest, the renouncing of moral and legal constraints on the use of force as that war unfolds. What does it embrace? The military, industrial, and economic mobilization, and a national will, a spirit, if you like, to sustain a war effort. And that national will, it permeates them all, but does it have a different measure? Well, it must have a different measure. How can it be measured? Does it begin, for example, at a relatively high level at the outset of a war, but decline over time due to the stresses placed upon it? Whereas perhaps the others, the military, the industrial, the economic, they may have to crank up as a war unfolds, but they also depend upon national will or spirit. So that relationship needs to be understood. It's had to be understood. There was an implication of vulnerability of that national will to physical and or psychological attack. And a point that's shouted at me from one of the sources that I looked at on this journey is from this source, Avner offer, total war is impossible because we cannot work out the totals. How does that relate to that first experience of bombing and the attempts to interpret it? If total war and its factors have to be taken into consideration, we're looking at a form of force, a use of air power within this context. What are the implications that we can bring out from that, and how did the early attempts to interpret the experience relate to that? So that was another one of my anchor points on this journey. And air power itself in the First World War. Tammy Davis Biddle there. The history of strategic bombing in the 20th century is a history of the tension between imagined possibilities and technical realities. Of course, the technology wasn't there. To an extent, it's never been there for to realise the potential of air power that's been identified. But in the First World War, you do get, I would suggest, within a compressed period of time, quite a significant development of bombing capability. It develops in that 4-year period, increases in range, payload, navigation and targeting ability, the bomb caliber, the aircrew experience and proficiency. It marches forward, but it's always rudimentary. It's always rudimentary, and the long-range bombing capability and the apportionment of it is always less than that accorded to air power in relation to the battlefront. And then there's the wider context of air power between 1914-18 and the significance of its experience in terms of that potential. Infancy, occasionally spectacular, increasingly important, yet largely unessential. but virtually every theory, attitude, ideal, hope and debate that was to mark the course of air warfare for a quarter of a century afterwards was foreshadowed. There does seem to be a good deal of evidence to support that. And if we can accept that, then what does that imply for the first attempts, the first very basic attempts to try and interpret the experience of using air power in this way? I've deliberately stood away from taking a lecture approach to this. It's not how I saw this session, and please don't let me do all the talking. Come on in. But a general pattern, a picture of what was done and generally why it was done. And those statistics of German airship raids, German aircraft raids, they are significant for their time. They're not huge, but they reflect in its purpose a shift, an increasing shift, focusing on the undermining of the morale of the British people and government, so that it's most evident by 1917 when daylight raids by the Gotha bombers with a principal target of central London were to be launched simultaneously with unrestricted U-boat warfare. I thought that was an interesting linkage as well. The main object was the moral intimidation of the British nation and the crippling of the will to fight. The secondary objectives by that stage, munitions factories, lines of communication, those coastal military targets, drawing air defence resources away from the Western Front. Maybe that was a reflection of the real technical ability of bombing. But it's this shift, increasing shift towards undermining morale and will to fight, and what that was based upon. What sort of evidence was in place to make that even feasible? And building up some criteria for success following that experience. That's from the British official history, 1935. On military grounds, the air attacks were overwhelmingly justified by the results. By that time, of course, there was an agenda in place in this country that was looking very seriously at this experience, but looking at it through a particular lens that wanted to emphasize the significance of the bombing and what it achieved. And in some respects, it was a blinkered vision. But setting that aside, it was based on a degree of evidence that demonstrated an effect. The investment in UK air defence by the summer of 1918 was quite significant. And there was evidence. There was evidence available, to an extent questionable evidence, that it could affect industrial production. It could have an effect on worker efficiency. There were some measures there that could be used. How significant were they? What did they really mean? And the question started to fall into place for me, looking at the surveys, was the extent to which the right questions were asked, the extent to which they knew what questions to ask, the extent to which perhaps we can look at it now, with the benefit of hindsight admittedly, of where those questions might have been better directed. But there was the bank. These were facts. Sorry.
Ian, it just strikes me that the results are incremental and temporary, which in a way accords with Second World War experience, that you can bomb a factory, and it has an impact on output, but then that output can be restored. And these results or these effects are certainly not the kind of overwhelming results that Ludendorff in your previous slide is talking about.
No, and I think
so there's a disconnect there, as there is in the Second World War, between the intention and the effect?
Well, I think there's certainly the disconnect, and I think a theme within that is the extent to which you've got a greater emphasis on morale and an increasing, rather unfounded confidence of how fragile that was. So the expectation levels are rising, but the actual measures that you can apply in terms of tangible measurements. How long has a factory stopped? What are the implications for production? If workers are driven away from the factory, how long do they stay away? These were to an extent measurable, but if you're trying to link them with something that may be decisive in terms of an approach to a will to fight, a will to support a war effort, that's where you move from the tangible into the very nebulous, and that's where that disconnect is. And I don't think. Certainly, I don't think that was being given enough scrutiny, and the early surveys, the kind, also didn't give it enough critical assessment. And it's thinking about that sort of dissonance that starts to put into context that the wrong questions were being asked of indeed the wrong people, I would suggest, when it came to the interpretation of this experience and trying to pull out what was meaningful through a lens that was very much wishful thinking, had become wishful thinking. Are you happy to keep me? I'll keep going. Okay? Right. Building up criteria for success then, and building up evidence, but also the difficulty in interpreting it. Initial shock effect, yes, both from the airships and later the aircraft race. There's protest, there's anger, there's fear. And there's calls for retaliation, but there's no widespread breakdown of law and order. You can measure the economic and industrial effects in a very localized way, causing of stoppages, the effect on production. But how do you measure the morale effect and the form that it can take? To what extent could civilians be prepared for being under fire? You can't do that in the same way as perhaps you can prepare your military service personnel to come under fire. And there's pressure. In the British experience, there's pressure on government. The force of public opinion becomes a factor in the decision to create an air ministry, to merge the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps into a new service in 1918, which is very much linked to an ability to retaliate, to bring this form of war to the enemy. And this was something that, a source that perhaps is very much rooted in its time, and one that perhaps we have to be careful with. Who would perhaps question that now? But there's something that was written that stuck in my mind. Democracies perhaps get the sort of war they deserve. Maybe that is a truth that we're still coming to terms with. And it was perhaps inevitable that popular clamour could override purely military considerations. But it's understanding the clamour. What's fear, what's anger? What's the difference between the two? What's this? Yeah.
Sorry, let me interrupt. Was there a difference between the perception of the air raids and the bombardment of the coastal towns? For example, Scarborough and a few of the other East Coast towns were. Is it the newness of this capability?
I think there's a lot of parallels there from what I've looked into. The shock effect, the indignation, the anger, not least on the call to be protected. I think that was significant. But there is also that this does have an effect that's separate from that in terms of the how can I put it, the novelty perhaps of a form of attack which is very difficult to see a defence against. If you're bombarded from the sea, where's the Royal Navy? The Navy could be there. Where if you're being bombed from the air, what do you do about that? You have to you have the basics, the very basics in place before the First World War that gradually increase of protection against air attack, but that takes time. The question then is how to what extent your public are being put under pressure. What's the rate and scale of the bombing effect? It's not that much, but it could be quite significant where those bombs fall. And it's and that's where a pattern starts to fall into place. It's the build-up of pressure and how that works in a society that has to be galvanized for total war and kept at a peak of total war. So.
But I don't think we should underestimate the effect of this too, not just the air campaign, but also the campaign from the sea, against a British public that had felt very protected prior to 1914 by the Channel, by the Royal Navy. This is the first time in a long time first time, in a very long time that Britain itself is attacked, and that must have a fairly important effect on politicians, on society, etc. And I think, in effect, this is what's happening, and this is why the Germans are doing it. And I think you're absolutely right. They overestimate the effect on morale, but nonetheless, it does have an important impact. It does have an important effect that we tend to forget, going through the blitz of the Second World War and the destruction that that caused. This is one of the first times that Britain is actually being attacked. There was an awareness of the risk, of the potential before the outbreak of the First World War, but this is where the test is. This is when this is really when it comes home, and it's how that pressure, how the protest, the anger, maybe the fear, starts to channel upwards to get to, and how that process works, how that interactive process works, so that you actually get a political decision, and quite a significant one. There are several strands, I think, to the British experience of employing long-range bombing. There's some more evidence, I would say, of a systematic and military-industrial focus on the effort when you have the Royal Naval Air Service Third Wing established in the summer of 1916 to bring under attack the Saar industrial region. There seems to be a fairly strong linkage between what the industries in that area were doing, in terms of, not least in terms of U-boat production, and bringing that under attack. There seems to be a less emphasis on a morale expectation. They're after industries that matter. But when you get an increase on the pressure on Britain's society, and you get a greater increase in the pressure for reprisals, then this again starts to change. And you get also I think a significant thread. You start to get a greater level of political involvement in the decision-making of how this weapon's got to be used. It's moving away from the particular control of the military commanders in the field. More, it's becoming a weapon that the politicians want a greater degree of control of. Unrealized potential. Well, we have the independent force established in June 1918, not long after the creation of the Royal Air Force itself. We've got Trenchard, who commanded the Royal Flying Corps, in command. The sense, and I think there's a good bit of evidence about this, and there's people in the room who will certainly correct me, I'm sure, but he wasn't very happy about this concept at this time. Most unhappy about this concept, I would suggest, and probably didn't buy into it as he could have done, for good reasons perhaps. But looking at the figures of what the independent force tried to do with a very limited force, there was a lot of tactical diversions. There was an emphasis on bombing German airfields, which there was a question mark, which didn't chime well with the expectations that were held in London at a political level and through the Air Ministry of what this force should be doing at this time. So it's there's a dissonance already in place. The bombing is not systematic. It's not doing what some people feel it should be doing, and it's very more tactically orientated. Although there are some raids which were considered to be worth investigating at the end of the war, as I'll move on to briefly in a few moments. What's happening
in society itself and about that pressure. That's just a snapshot from the, I don't know whether you can read it very well, can you? Can you read just about, I guess? Yeah. It's the parliamentary debate, first air estimate, 21st of February 1918 from Hansard. And you have, in that debate, you have a fairly strong argument being made that we've got to bomb German towns for the morale effect that we can achieve against it. From what study I've been able to make of the psychology of the German people, the bombing of German towns will not anger them, but it will frighten them and break their morale.
It's quite interesting that the sentence before that is, it angers us but does not frighten us.
Well, exactly.
Complete.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't apply to us for some reason.
And there's this, you know, this view, the war will be won by whichever country can keep its morale longer. If that's total war, it's not a perception that relates to we're not going to win this by greater industrial production, although that must be there. We're not going to win this by larger forces creating them. That's got to be there. But it's this keeping the morale up longer. That's what's now very much at the fore in some people. But then within the same debate, and don't strain your eyes too much, but you can see a counter to that. And maybe that's reflective of the incoherence, the confusion perhaps, that was in place about what bombing could do and what it should be, what it should do. And to an extent, you know, those bells still chime.
I just add to that, if I may, in terms of the fact that, of course, when Trenchard and Hay both side with King's point of view, which is that you don't conduct reprisals, because there are a whole, as you'll see, because there are a whole variety of instances where people say, well, we should do is we should bomb German open towns, and we should bomb German after hospital ships are struck and things like that. Probably by accident. And Trenchard and Hay are very clear you don't use aircraft to do it. Because it's contrary to the law of war, it's contrary to morale, you actually don't retaliate. And then something shifts in the political firmament in 1917. Is it Lloyd George? Is it public response? Or is the public response actually cover for Lloyd George trying to reduce Haig's control over the British Expeditionary Force? It's an interesting debate. But Trenchard throughout the war tends to be on the side of not frightening, not being beastly to the Germans, beastly to civilians.
Well, I mean, you set that against maybe a conviction he had in place that where it really mattered, where you really need your air power, was on the Western Front, which he didn't seem to move away from in that while the war was on. Then that would make a good deal of logic, and it must have been an immense imperative, the Western Front and its demands, and looking at the independent force that maybe you've got command of. You're not unaware of its limitations. You're not unaware of the fact that its equipment is well below par and expectations. What are you going to do with it? What can you do with it? That could have been very much a question in his mind. But that, I think, represents some of the confusion, maybe the incoherence in the perception of a country under attack. Maybe that's significant. Okay. Just a bit then on the quality of evidence. That's an image that's appended to one of the reports that we hold in the library here. There are several that were produced by a small team from the RAF independent force that went into Western Germany at the end of the First World War for a fairly relatively brief period of time to look at what had been achieved by the bombing. And as that photograph would indicate, they were very reliant on the material that the Germans themselves had amassed. The town records, the photographs, what German factory owners, industrialists were willing to tell them. And I think that's an interesting theme in itself, because under no circumstances could I imagine myself as a German factory owner, not long after the end of total war, and a bunch of British officers come up and ask me what the effect of their bombing, why should I help them? I certainly wouldn't feel inclined to help them. And that was appreciated. So there's a degree of skepticism of what was told. But you are, if you're going to do this, you are reliant on the sort of information you can get, where you can get it from, and how you can get it, because at the time when the raids were being made, you weren't getting quality data indicating to you what was happening. How could you at that stage? Prisoner of wars, interviews, newspaper reports, there was means of feeding intelligence, but how valid was that? Some post-war German statistics there that, you know, maybe are interesting to set against those for Britain. Again, not surprisingly, in the period when the official history was written, those statistics are seen as less important, set alongside what by this stage is very confidently being depicted, being described as the weakening of national will, linked with war weariness and hunger. Now that may be an important theme. If your society is under the pressure of total war, and it may be vulnerable to a form of attack, but what are the other pressures that maybe need to be in place that are going to accentuate that effect? Do you need to be at a stage where you've had 4 years of war, a number of years of naval blockade, in order to be sufficiently vulnerable? And the reduction in war production that was gauged, and again the diversion of air effort to defend against raids. And there was a lot of wishful thinking on the British interpretation of just to what extent German air units had been taken from the battlefront to defend against the longer range bombing. So you've got this small team, and shortly afterwards an American, slightly larger American team going in to look at these towns, look at these airfields, look at the railways, the factories, the blast furnaces that had been brought under attack. That's quite spectacular. Again, it's one from the report on railway bombing that we have in the library here. But the point is that was a bit of luck there, because a bomb on a raid actually hit an ammunition train. So the bang was spectacular, and so was the effect. It wasn't always like that. But what there was, in terms of bombing railways, there was evidence of stoppages and delays, but how significant were they? And what was the picture that was starting to be built up? There were formidable challenges, resources, time, the reliance on German records and willingness to talk. That was what they were looking for, the material damage, the morale effect. Sorry.
Ian, just wondering, in terms of you talked about the investigation team. I know about when they conduct kind of reports into the maritime airpower and the immediate post-war period, there are 3 investigations, and one is a Royal Navy team, one is an RAF team, and one is mixed.
Mm.
Is this purely RAF personnel, and does that cause any ructions, or is there no dispute over this at all?
I've not come
and the government happy for it to be purely RAF?
I've not come across any ructions in that respect, but it was a very small team. It was from the independent force, intelligence officers from the independent force. Now, perhaps at the time that was logical, but it begs the question of whether, to what extent they were the best people to be asking the questions with the assumptions that they may have had behind them. I mean, if you're going to look at the morale effect, then maybe you should be looking at visiting the hospitals, talking to doctors, people like that. There's no evidence of that. They go to the targets, they talk to the factory owners. They're getting a picture, but it's a slightly distorted picture, I think. And from the American team, and their bombing was not of a sufficient scale to really be included in this. So their bombing was predominantly tactical. So when they're sending this team in, it's essentially looking at what the British and to an extent the French had done. And that emerges fairly clearly the lack of what it is in their perception a lack of a systematic approach to the bombing. Now, I don't know whether you stand a chance of reading that, but I've got it there. It's a Public Record Office, National Archives, I should say, getting old. It's a snapshot from a report in 1920, which was a compilation of some of the earlier bombing survey reports, and to an extent, even by that time, was rather skewing the evidence towards what we want to read about the morale effect particularly. But you can just get a sense of the type of data that was coming back and where it was coming from. The consensus, shall I read a bit of it? I don't know whether you can even possibly see that from here. German opinion on bombing, under the heading of railways. The consensus of opinion of our bombing by the German officials is summed up in the word annoying. Well, I wonder how we could interpret that. Judging from observations and conversations with German officials, this statement is neither an exaggeration or an underestimate. It was annoying. Raids have been far too frequent to allow them to belittle our bombing, and instances of really serious raids have left an impression on their minds never to be forgotten. Well, perhaps if you've been under bombing, that may be true enough. But how far can you reasonably take a piece of evidence like that, if you can call it evidence, and how far can you build on it? Considering the number of raids carried out on stations, the officials think they have been lucky and sum up the damage caused as slight. The only exception was at Metz, where they state that the damage had been considerable. Well, again, you've got statements here which are challenging to distill. What does considerable damage mean? The surveys could go some way to looking at that in a physical sense. But what considerable damage may mean, how that should be interpreted, is another question. They considered our shooting was moderate, but pointed out that it varied very much. Well, that's not surprising, given the technologies at the time. The moral and blast furnaces, the moral effect of the various raids was admitted to have been very considerable. The constant alarms and attacks had got on the workmen's nerves. Well, is there an implication there that you do it once, they don't like it, they can get over it? If you didn't do it often enough, consistently enough, what's going to happen to their nerves? But there's also evidence that if they put shelters in place, and there was pressure for the factory owners to do that, then that sort of turned it round again. So there's a lot of questions coming out from these surveys, and I think it's better to go to the surveys that were done in the field rather than this compilation here. But there is a pattern that's starting to come up, a pattern that I think is not so much related to what strategic bombing did, but how we have a pattern emerging of how you can learn from experience, how you try and interpret experience, what the pitfalls are from that. And that's it. But if you're interested, we've got the bombing survey reports in the library. They're worth a look. They're a historical curiosity. They could be the beginning of a journey which may be worth taking further in terms of the overall pattern of interpreting the effects of long-range, later strategic bombing. What are the patterns and the trends that emerge? And that's what I've, in time and circumstances have allowed, I've sort of busied myself in recently. Christina?
Yeah, no, I'm intrigued because I haven't looked at these bombing surveys, but do they give a sense of a differentiation between the thinking and effects of the Royal Naval Air Service versus, say, the independent force? Because I've always sort of held the Royal Naval Air Service up as a pinnacle of, brilliant conceptual work when it comes to this. Is that true?
Well,
do you see that?
yes. So there is a.
Slip me a fiver later.
Yeah, there is certainly an acknowledgement of what was done in that period. It's not solely focused on the independent force, but the problem is, of course, is that by the time you get to this period at the end of the war and just after, it's still that lens of morale effect and the degree of wishful thinking is starting to skew the more perhaps the more serious questions that could have come out, and starting to skew the evidence a bit. But, there you go. Yeah.
Is there any shift in the broader principles or lessons that come out of these surveys in comparison to what we see with the Gulf War Air Power Survey, many decades later? So is there a shift in what it appears air power can do over all these decades?
I think yes, there is. I mean, I think it's. I think that's part of the interest. It's a learning journey. There are some. I think there are. I mean, not having gone quite far down that road yet, but I think there are shifts. But I think there are also some fairly significant continuities if you link that up to expectation, and I think a continuity in the extent to which maybe you can look at evidence to find what you want to find. I'm not convinced that isn't a continuity that runs throughout this. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but we'll see. The social sciences, as we understand them today, are very much in their infancy in the period of the First World War. When you say that this is a survey, is there any explicit scientific method being used, or are these, groups of officers going around having a look at some damage?
That's the sense I get. I don't get any sense of systematic scientific methodology to the extent that you start to see that in after the Second World War.
Yeah.
I mean, there's limitations then, but you don't see it. You don't see it here. No.
But I think this is part of that bigger, broader shift that's going on, isn't it? That the Second World War is the fruit of the first in many respects, and going back to that scientific approach and whatnot. I mean, I think you can see this very much in how air power and sea power is initially used as a kind of blunt weapon for morale and moral effect. People hadn't thought about war in those terms, even deeply in those terms before. I think before 1914, it's very much a focus on short war, on the decisiveness on the battlefield, decisive battle, all of these things. That proves to be unfounded, and they get themselves in a position that they don't really know how to deal with. So many of these things, whether it's U-boat warfare, whether it's raiding the coasts of Britain, whether it's air raids, these are all feeling their way to what becomes much more systematic and a much more systematic approach kind of in the interwar period and then the Second World War. But these are, as I think you pointed out, these are very much the first attempts to say, well, what do we do with these new weapons? What do we do with these new things? We know we need to hit the enemy morale, but how do we do that? And how do we measure then if we are having that effect beyond a collapse? Which is what people are still thinking about, is that collapse and moral collapse, when it comes, is something that comes rapidly and decisively. And I think this is still this hangover of a kind of pre-1914 view of warfare that we're seeing play out even in 1918.
There's no sense that they're interrogating or trying to understand a system. There's no, and maybe even scientists at that time would have been pretty horrified at what these fellows were doing and how they were doing it. There's not the intelligence officers that have just conducted a very rudimentary bombing campaign were maybe not the best people to do this. They were perhaps the only people to do this. And they went to what they knew, and they were looking for what they thought they knew, I think.
And just to follow up on Neil's question, really. So you have these intelligence officers going out looking at various things that were hit and so forth, perhaps even finding things that were hit, for instance. But who's actually writing up their terms of reference, you know, was there a broader drafting team direction to this?
No.
Just random reports?
The reports aren't exactly random, but they're given a mandate to do this, to go and look, and beyond that, I think they have it was the sense I get they were learning on the job, frankly. They knew where they would go. I think they had a what I would call a rudimentary sense of the type of question that they wanted to ask, what they were looking for. But a lot of what you seem to see is pictures of holes in the ground, pictures of cracked blast furnaces. But they're building up a massive, not really a mass, they're building up an amount of data that I'm not even sure they know really what they're going to do with. It's the beginnings in a number of ways. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm probably portraying a lamentable ignorance here of things that happened at the end of the First World War, but to what extent was this approach, this kind of lessons learned attempt, mirrored by other departments and services? I think particularly of the Ministry for Blockade, for instance. Was there any credible attempt to discern the impact that economic warfare had on Germany? I anticipate, I don't really know the answer to that question, and they still have no idea as to the figures of casualties, and the influenza epidemic probably intervenes to a certain extent, but was this approach mirrored? I guess in other nations, you mentioned the US, was there a similar French, Italian, even obviously more problematic on the Eastern Front, but was there any...
I've not come across any references to it. Logically, there should have been. Maybe the naval historians would probably know that about what was done to investigate the effects of the blockade. I don't. That's not something else.
Well, you get to have Bell's history of the blockade.
Yeah.
That wasn't released for years, was it?
No, but it was written,
but
it was suppressed, yeah. And that was probably the closest I know of the Navy attempting to do that.
Ian, it's sort of a question from a position of ignorance here. To what extent do those who are involved in concepts of strategic bombing in the First World War have any influence on what happens in the Second World War? The reason I ask is because the majority of senior Royal Air Force officers in the Second World War involved in or around strategic bombing have grown up in imperial policing, the imperial policing air role, not in the strategic bombing air role in World War I. So Harris, for example, Von Harris is a fighter pilot who then goes out to imperial policing, bombing tribes on the Northwest frontier. The same goes for other senior RAF officers who rise to prominence in the 1940s. So is there a sense of institutional connection within the service between the experience of 1918 and the experience of 1942?
Well, I think my take on that is, and this is somewhere where I've yet to go, but I'll stick my neck out a bit on this. I think that the problem is that the experience of this fairly rudimentary bombing is not really being understood at all. If it's an influence, it's what we can now look back as a misperception. David, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, there are two facts, and I'm just going to answer that. First, the Chief of the Air Staff Newell, who's the boss of 41 Wing and 8 Brigade, so he's the independent force before Trenchard takes it over. So he's Chief of the Air Staff obviously through to 1940, so he clearly has a certain degree of influence. And the other one is Trenchard. Trenchard is the father of the Royal Air Force, and we know that there are letters that he wrote that haven't been released. They're literally the shoebox in the sort of Trenchard Towers, owned by the current Viscount. And the suspicion is that some of that material actually is Trenchard giving, as a five-star rank, giving direction to people that he sort of brought up in the Air Force, telling them how they should be conducting a bombing.
Well, no, I mean, the reason I ask is simply because Pretty Sapir's article blames it's the imperial policing role and the liking that the RAF has for bombing poor people, that then sets it on the way to strategic bombing. That's effectively what she's accusing of. Now, I don't believe that at all, and you've taken exception to that, but it's a narrative that's emerged, and she's a very influential historian over in the States, imperial historian. So, you know, getting this sort of redressing that sort of image, I think, is quite important.
Well, I would agree, but I think it was influential. It was there. How could it not be if you commanded the? But was the experience that you'd lived through actually being skewed or hostage to political and military and service imperatives at a much later?
Just going back on that, Chris, well, the other point is that all these people who are doing the policing and the bombing, when they get into positions of authority, although the doctrine talks about the area of authority, what they're doing is they're spending all their cash on the defence of the United Kingdom. And I think this is where Satya misses that point. Especially when the bombing survey is quite, because the bombing keep falling back on the bombing survey. She misses the point that Harris is prone to hyperbole and all these ridiculous comments about coastal commands and obstacles to military during the Battle of the Atlantic. This is Bert Harris. He's prone to outbreaks of hyperbole, and the air's like, that's Bert, big Bert. And then try to ignore it. The key person who she misses, Winston Spencer Churchill. Churchill's the man who goes bomb, 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 in sort of in tribute to bomb, boom, boom, boom. He's the person who drives that, and I think that's possibly an interesting area to put. What's Churchill's view on all of this? Remember that when this goes on, he's Secretary of State for War and Air. The hidden hand of Winston Churchill is there and needs to be sort of found because of the fact that what he then is he covers his tracks because he writes the history.
It's an interesting progression for Churchill because when he's at the Admiralty in all of the pre-war period, he's immensely frustrated with any kind of war plan that's relying on any kind of idea of steady pressure. And obviously his explosion with Fisher in early 1915 comes on the back of Fisher's December memorandum in which he uses those very words. I advocate a strategy of steady pressure, and Churchill's by disposition and inclination is utterly incapable of acknowledging those as legitimate methods of warfare.
Yeah, there's a few interesting journeys of change with some of these leading people, and I have to push off too, I'm afraid. But well, thank you all for your attention. And for
put our hands together and say thank you to you.
Well,
We look forward to more research on this as well.
well, indeed. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, it's really good.
Well,
it was really interesting.
I was going
I think there's some really interesting angles to it.
well, I was going to ask you frankly what you thought.
I think, I think your issue in a sense of, are they asking the right questions is an important one.
Yeah.
And, but I think beyond that, you've got separate issues. You've got, how are these ideas developed and